Sleeping Greek myths for sleep. Relaxing bedtime stories from ancient Greece. Hey, everyone. Tonight we're drifting back to the hazy world of Greek myths. So, go ahead. Dim the lights, settle into whatever pillow fortress you've engineered for yourself, and let your shoulders sink. We're not in a hurry. The only goal here is to let these ancient, occasionally absurd stories wash over you like lukewarm honey. The Greeks, as you'll see, had a particular talent for making their gods sound simultaneously terrifying and very, very petty, which is comforting, really, because if a thunderbolt-hurling immortal can still waste an afternoon sulking over an insult, then perhaps we can forgive ourselves for getting annoyed when the Wi-Fi drops. Now, tonight's drift begins with the king of the gods himself, Zeus. Of course it does. It always does. He had more stories about himself than anyone else, mostly because he couldn't keep his interests in check. But we're not here to rush. We're here to glide slowly across the cloud tops of Olympus, pausing now and then to marvel at just how ridiculous immortality can get. So, let's start with Zeus, because of course we are. Zeus, technically, was supposed to be the great cosmic authority, Lord of the sky, dispenser of justice, and father to, well, nearly everyone who was anyone in Greek mythology. But instead of a model of serene dignity, he comes across more like that messy uncle who insists on carving the turkey, then spends the rest of the holiday making questionable choices. He overthrew his father, Cronus, in a family coup, because apparently devouring your children whole wasn't the most sustainable parenting technique. Cronus had swallowed each of his offspring in turn, a kind of prehistoric version of helicopter parenting, except with actual digestive acids. Zeus, the youngest, managed to avoid being eaten thanks to his mother Rhea, who handed Cronus a rock, wrapped in baby clothes. Naturally, Cronus swallowed it whole. This tells you everything you need to know about his attention to detail. Once Zeus grew up, he forced his father to vomit up all the siblings, fully grown no less. Imagine a sort of mythological reverse buffet. Out popped Poseidon, Hades, Hera, Demeter, and Hestia, none the worse for wear despite having been stomach decor for years. And with that, Zeus declared himself king of the cosmos. Which is fine, except once you have unlimited power, you might think you'd spend some time on, I don't know, infrastructure or public services. But no, Zeus devoted most of his immortal schedule to disguising himself as swans, bulls, and occasionally golden rain, all in the pursuit of romance, or at the very least, in the pursuit of not being bored. One of the more famous incidents involved Europa, a Phoenician princess. Zeus, rather than striking up polite conversation, chose instead to transform into a magnificent white bull, which, to be fair, is a choice. Europa, enchanted by this oddly well-behaved bovine, climbed onto his back, at which point Zeus trotted straight into the sea and swam off with her to Crete. It's the kind of first date that would usually end in a police report, but in Greek mythology it somehow results in a dynasty of kings. Now the Greeks loved this story so much they ended up naming an entire continent after Europa. So the next time you hear Europe, just remember, you're technically living on land named after a woman abducted by a shape-shifting cow. Let's drift onward. Another of Zeus's more creative forms was the infamous golden shower, and not, unfortunately, the kind you're hoping it's not. In this particular myth, a princess named Danae was locked in a bronze tower by her father, Acrisius. He'd been told by an oracle that his grandson would one day kill him, and rather than confronting the possibility like an adult, Acrisius decided that the best strategy was simply to prevent his daughter from ever meeting anyone at all, which sounds airtight, until Zeus, with his particular skill set, decided that physical walls weren't really a problem. He turned himself into a stream of golden rain and trickled down through the roof. Danae, who had probably been quite bored, in that tower, found herself suddenly the mother of Perseus, future slayer of Medusa, which, if you think about it, means Acrisius's strategy backfired spectacularly. The lesson here is clear. If you hear a prophecy that your grandchild will kill you, maybe just invest in some counseling instead of designing an escape-proof fortress. And then there's Leda. Leda was a Spartan queen, already married, already busy. But Zeus, apparently bored of his bull form, decided that what he really wanted this time was to become a swan. Because of course he did. Accounts differ on what exactly happened. Ancient storytellers weren't big on consistent details, but the general consensus is that Leda encountered Zeus in swan form, and sometime thereafter laid eggs, out of which hatched Helen of Troy, the future cause of a decade-long war, and the Dioscuri, Castor and Pollux. Which makes Thanksgiving awkward when your family tree includes both poultry and immortality. Now, while Zeus was gallivanting about in increasingly creative disguises, the other gods weren't exactly models of calm dignity either. Hera, his wife and sister, because yes, those roles were not mutually exclusive on Olympus, spent much of her immortal existence inventing new and exciting ways to make his lovers miserable. You might think she would direct her fury at Zeus himself. But no. Hera preferred to make life as difficult as possible for the mortal women and children caught in the blast radius of her husband's attention span. Her method was consistent: ruin lives, curse offspring, and make sure that anyone remotely connected to Zeus regretted waking up in the morning. Take poor Io, for instance, a mortal priestess, unlucky enough to catch Zeus's wandering eye. To disguise his interest, Zeus transformed her into a cow, which, if nothing else, shows he had a limited imagination. Hera, not fooled in the slightest, demanded the cow as a gift. Then she set a giant, 100-eyed monster named Argus to guard her. Zeus eventually had Argus killed, by Hermes, naturally, because Zeus himself preferred delegation, but Hera salvaged some dignity by plucking out Argus's eyes and setting them into the tail of her sacred bird, the peacock. So next time you see a peacock fanning its feathers, remember, it's basically a memorial quilt of eyeballs. Sleep tight, let's float onward, gently, toward another tale. Persephone, the daughter of Demeter, goddess of grain, had the misfortune of being noticed by Hades, which is rarely good news. The lord of the underworld decided to simply abduct her into his realm. Because apparently nobody in Olympus had ever considered asking politely, Demeter, in her grief, refused to let crops grow, plunging the earth into famine. After some negotiation, a compromise was reached. Persephone would spend part of the year with her mother and part with Hades, and thus, according to Greek myth, the seasons were born. Now, this might sound poetic, but let's not overlook the fact that global agriculture was apparently disrupted because of one very awkward custody battle. The Greeks, at least, were honest about the fragility of existence. As we glide further into these myths, notice the pattern. The gods rarely demonstrate wisdom, but they excel at turning personal drama into world-shaping events. Crops fail, wars begin, continents get their names, all because immortals couldn't handle their own relationships. It's strangely human, which is probably why these myths linger so vividly. They're not just stories of thunderbolts and monsters. They're tales of people, or divine approximations of people, making the same petty, impulsive choices we all do, just on a much louder mythological scale. And with that, let's drift onward. God's behaving badly. So we've left Zeus mid-scandal, which is basically any day ending in a Y for him. Let's not linger too long with the king of Olympus, though. He's exhausting, and frankly, we'll never get to sleep if we try to catalog all his romantic field trips. Instead, let's drift sideways across the pantheon, where his siblings and offspring were busy making their own questionable life choices. Take Poseidon, lord of the sea, master of earthquakes, the original, don't talk to me until I've had my coffee personality. You might imagine him as dignified, wise, flowing beard glimmering in the salt spray. And yes, that's the painting version. The reality, according to the myths, was a god with the patience of a cat in a bathtub. Poseidon's career highlight reel mostly involves smashing things in anger. If the city of Troy ever wondered why it was constantly suffering divine sabotage, the answer was usually Poseidon didn't get paid. He and Apollo once helped build the walls of Troy, and when King Laomedon refused to reward them, never stiff a god, by the way, Poseidon retaliated by sending a sea monster to terrorize the place, which seems like a bit of an overreaction, but then Poseidon never did subtle. And speaking of subtlety, or lack thereof, Poseidon's personal life wasn't much better. He pursued Demeter, goddess of grain, but she wasn't interested. She disguised herself as a mare to escape him. Naturally, Poseidon turned into a stallion and pursued her anyway. The result was a horse named Arion, who could talk. Because of course he could. If nothing else, Greek mythology reassures us that unwanted advances have always been awkward, though not usually equine. Let's drift a little further toward Hades. Poor Hades, Lord of the Dead. He didn't really get invited to Olympus parties, which is what happens when your home decor consists of skeletons and pomegranate seeds. Now, unlike Zeus or Poseidon, Hades wasn't constantly gallivanting about. He mostly stayed put in the underworld, managing the dead with what we might generously call bureaucratic efficiency. If you've ever been to a DMV, you already understand the vibe. His one major scandal, as we mentioned earlier, was the abduction of Persephone. Even here, Hades wasn't the most terrifying figure, just socially inept. He wanted a queen. Instead of asking, he opened a sinkhole and dragged Persephone underground. Not exactly a meet cute, but what makes the story oddly tender is that later traditions soften it. Persephone becomes a queen in her own right, not just a captive. She and Hades end up ruling together, a gloomy but stable couple, which, compared to Zeus's track record, almost looks like relationship goals. Speaking of awkward divine households, let's float gently toward Hera. Now, Hera had a tough job. Imagine being the goddess of marriage while being married to Zeus, a man whose idea of fidelity involved shape-shifting into a shower of coins. Naturally, Hera's image suffers in the myths. She's cast as jealous, vindictive, perpetually angry. But really, who wouldn't be? If your immortal husband kept bringing home half-mortal children, you might develop a bit of a temper, too. Take poor Heracles, one of Zeus's most famous illegitimate sons. Hera despised him on principle. She sent snakes into his crib, which unfortunately for her, baby Heracles found more like chew toys. He strangled them without much fuss, which meant Hera had to get more creative. She eventually drove him into a frenzy that caused him to kill his wife and children, a horrifying act, even by Greek standards. His punishment was to complete 12 labors, which, incidentally, gave ancient storytellers plenty of material. But the origin of it all was just Hera's inability to tolerate Zeus's extracurriculars. It's a pattern you'll notice in these myths. The gods start petty, but the consequences spiral out into world-shaping sagas. Now, let's float over to Athena. Finally, a deity with something resembling composure, Athena, goddess of wisdom, strategy, and inconveniently timed owls. She was born in a way that makes modern medicine look positively straightforward. Zeus swallowed her mother, Metis, while she was pregnant. This was meant to prevent a prophecy from coming true, because apparently nobody in the family had learned that trying to dodge oracles only makes them worse. After a time, Zeus developed a splitting headache. Understandable, given the circumstances. He begged someone, accounts vary, but usually it's Hephaestus, the smith god, to crack open his skull with an axe. Out sprang Athena, fully grown, armored, and probably irritated. Which is one way to make an entrance. Athena became the patron goddess of Athens naturally after a contest with Poseidon. He offered the city a saltwater spring. She offered an olive tree. The people decided olives were slightly more practical. Then seawater, which, given the lack of indoor plumbing, was probably a fair call. Poseidon sulked, as usual. Athena became the namesake of one of the greatest cities in history. What's striking about Athena is that she rarely indulges in the melodrama of her relatives. She doesn't abduct mortals, doesn't turn into barnyard animals. Instead, she mostly dispenses cool, if occasionally inconvenient, wisdom, which might be why she stands out. In a pantheon defined by chaos, she's one of the few who seems like she'd actually pay her rent on time. Let's drift now toward Dionysus, the Phos, god of wine, theater, and questionable decision-making. Dionysus was the original party god, patron of intoxication and blurred boundaries. His followers, the Maenads, would dance themselves into frenzies, tear apart animals with their bare hands, and then call it a religious experience, which, in fairness, is one way to spend a weekend. His birth story is appropriately chaotic. His mother, Semele, was a mortal loved by Zeus. Hera, disguised as an old woman, tricked her into asking Zeus to reveal his true form. When he did, Semele was instantly incinerated, mortals not being built for raw divine glory. Zeus, panicking, sewed the unborn Dionysus into his thigh until the child was ready to be born. Thus, Dionysus is sometimes called the twice-born, which is mythological shorthand for, our stories don't always make sense, but please, just go with it. Dionysus, unlike many gods, was associated with liberation, for better and worse. He represents joy, release, intoxication, but also the dangers of losing control. He's the friend who insists on one more round, and you know you'll regret it tomorrow, but you agree anyway. Now, if you're still awake, and if you're not, that's perfectly fine, let's gently float toward Hephaestus, the smith god. Hephaestus was the craftsman of Olympus, builder of palaces, forger of weapons, but his personal life was less gleaming. He was born, depending on the version, either from Hera alone, out of spite for Zeus's many affairs, or he was hurled off Olympus by Zeus for being too unattractive. Either way, he grew up with a limp which, in the eyes of the Greeks, made him a divine misfit. Yet despite being shunned, Hephaestus built wonders. His forge, hidden under volcanoes, churned out armor, jewelry, even robotic servants of gold. He married Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty, though the marriage was famously rocky. She preferred the company of Ares, god of war. Hephaestus once set a trap, a fine net invisible to the eye, and caught them in the act, dragging them before the other gods, which turned Olympus into something very close to an immortal reality show. It's telling that the one god defined by skill and craftsmanship was mocked, while the ones defined by chaos and violence got endless adoration. Some things never change. And speaking of Ares, let's drift to him briefly. God of war, lover of Aphrodite, professional disaster. Unlike Athena, who represented the strategy and discipline of battle, Ares was raw, messy violence. He was bloodlust in divine form. The Greeks never liked him much, unlike the Romans, who adored him as Mars. In Greek stories, he often comes across as a bit of a blustering fool, easily wounded, easily humiliated. Once, the giants Otis and Ephialtes actually managed to trap him in a bronze jar for over a year. Nobody noticed, which tells you everything about how much the other gods valued his company. Yet, despite his flaws, Ares endured. Because every civilization has to admit, war, for all its stupidity, never quite goes away. Let's pause here. Close your eyes if they're still open. Notice how these stories weave together. None of the gods are flawless. Most are deeply insecure. Their so-called immortality just magnifies the quirks and mistakes of human nature. They are, in other words, not so different from us, just louder, stranger, and far more likely to turn into livestock when the mood strikes. And with that thought, let's drift onward into more tales next time. Heroes, curses, and unfortunate royals so far, we've lingered among the gods, floating through their scandals and petty rivalries. But myths are never just about immortals. The Greeks also told endless stories of heroes, half-mortal children, of the gods, and unlucky kings and queens who stumbled into catastrophes, usually thanks to divine interference. It's time to drift into those stories. Think of it as zooming in from Olympus to ground level, where the mortals tried to survive under the constant shadow of gods who treated them like chess pieces. Let's start with Heracles. We touched on him earlier. That poor, illegitimate son of Zeus, who became the center of Hera's wrath. His life was basically one long punishment. The man could never just sit, or have a hobby, or enjoy a normal family dinner. Every time he tried, Hera showed up with snakes, madness, or a brand new trial. After Hera's curse drove him to kill his own family, a horrific act that Greek storytellers relayed with their usual bluntness, Heracles had to atone by serving King Eurystheus. Eurystheus, it turned out, was a cowardly bureaucrat who delegated all the dirty work to Heracles while hiding inside a bronze jar. Yes, a grown man hiding in a jar while his half-divine cousin was out fighting monsters. The 12 labors followed, slaying the Nemean lion with its impenetrable hide, capturing the golden hind of Artemis, cleaning the Augean stables, which involved shoveling out decades of divine horse manure. It's telling that one of the most famous heroes in Greek myth is remembered as much for pest control and sanitation as for killing monsters. And yet, despite completing every impossible task, Heracles never escaped misfortune. He lived a life of endless toil, dying painfully from poisoned blood. In the end, the gods made him immortal, which was less a reward, more like, well, after everything, maybe you deserve a permanent break. It's oddly comforting, though. Even, the strongest man in myth was just another pawn, swept around by curses, grudges, and family feuds. Let's drift now to Theseus. Theseus was the Athenian hero, famous for killing the Minotaur. The Minotaur, if you need a reminder, was a half-man, half-bull creature locked in a labyrinth on Crete. The labyrinth was so complex that once you entered, you couldn't escape, which sounds suspiciously like IKEA on a Saturday. Now, the backstory of the Minotaur is, let's call it awkward. King Minos of Crete failed to sacrifice a beautiful bull to Poseidon, keeping it for himself. The god, predictably vengeful, cursed Minos' wife Pasiphae to fall in love with the bull. She asked the craftsman Daedalus to build her a wooden cow disguise. The result was the Minotaur, which means, yes, one of the most terrifying monsters of Greek myth existed because of marital dishonesty and poor costume design. Athens, unfortunately, had to send regular tributes of young men and women to be devoured by the Minotaur. Theseus volunteered to end this. With help from Ariadne, Minos' daughter, he navigated the labyrinth using a ball of thread, killed the Minotaur, and escaped. But naturally, he managed to ruin things afterward. He abandoned Ariadne on an island, despite her saving his life. Then, when he sailed back to Athens, he forgot to change his ship's sails from black to white, the agreed-upon signal to his father Aegeus that he was alive. Seeing the black sails, Aegeus threw himself into the sea, which has been called the Aegean ever since. So, the great Athenian hero built his fame on monster slaying and ended up causing his father's death by sheer absent-mindedness, which in its own way is very human. And then there's Oedipus, a name that immediately brings to mind Freud, who, millennia later, would really milk the poor man's story for his own theories. Oedipus's life was cursed before he was even born. His parents, King Laius and Queen Jocasta of Thebes, received a prophecy. Their son would kill his father and marry his mother. Logical response? Kill the baby, or at least abandon him on a mountainside. Naturally, the gods didn't allow that. Oedipus was rescued, raised elsewhere, and grew up oblivious. One day he encountered Laius on the road. They quarreled because ancient royalty had zero patience, and Oedipus killed him, unaware it was his father. Later, he solved the riddle. of the Sphinx, freeing Thebes, and was rewarded by marrying the widowed queen, his mother, Jocasta. For years, nobody noticed. Eventually, the truth emerged. Jocasta hanged herself. Oedipus gouged out his own eyes, and Thebes spiraled into yet more tragedies, because why stop at one cursed generation? It's worth noting that the Greeks told this story not as lurid scandal, but as a meditation on fate. No matter how carefully you try to avoid a prophecy, your attempts to escape will only drag you into its fulfillment, which, admittedly, is not the most soothing bedtime lesson, but it does make your own bad decisions look less dramatic by comparison. Let's drift next to Agamemnon. Agamemnon was the king of Mycenae, brother of Menelaus, husband of Clytemnestra. You might remember him as the commander of the Greek forces in the Trojan War, which on paper sounds glorious. In practice, his career was one long disaster. The war itself started because Paris of Troy abducted or eloped with Helen, wife of Menelaus. But Agamemnon managed to make things worse before they even left port. To sail to Troy, he needed favorable winds, but had offended Artemis. The solution? Sacrifice his daughter, Iphigenia, which he did. Family bonding? Bronze Age. Addition. Naturally, this did not endear him to his wife. Clytemnestra spent the war years nursing a grudge and an affair with Aegisthus. When Agamemnon finally returned victorious, she killed him in the bath. Stabbed by your own wife while soaking, hardly the heroic ending bards like to sing about, and then their son, Orestes, avenged his father by killing his mother, which triggered the Furies, goddesses of vengeance, to hound him across Greece. The entire dynasty turned into one long soap opera of revenge, guilt, and divine meddling. It's striking how many of these myths revolve around families imploding. Murdered children, betrayed spouses, doomed offspring. You might expect the gods to step in with some guidance. But no. They mostly watched, occasionally tossing in a curse like seasoning. Now, let's turn gently to the Trojan War itself. This war, despite all the battles and heroes, began in the pettiest way possible. A beauty contest. At the wedding of Peleus and Thetis, Eris, the goddess of discord, was not invited. She threw a golden apple into the festivities, inscribed to the fairest. 3 goddesses claimed it: Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite. They asked Zeus to decide. Sensibly, he refused. Instead, he delegated to Paris, a Trojan prince. Each goddess offered him a bribe. Hera promised power. Athena promised wisdom and victory in battle. Aphrodite promised the most beautiful woman in the world, Helen of Sparta. Paris, demonstrating both poor judgment and a lack of foresight, chose Aphrodite. And so Helen left, or was abducted, and the Greeks launched 1,000 ships. A decade of war followed. Thousands died, cities burned, and all because 3 goddesses refused to share an apple. It's hard not to admire the absurdity. Entire civilizations collapsing simply because immortals wanted compliments. If you're still awake, let's pause for a moment. Notice the rhythm here. Gods behaving badly, heroes stumbling through impossible trials, royals trapped by fate. The stories repeat over and over. Someone makes a selfish decision. A curse follows. Generations suffer. It's strangely lulling. These tales, told for centuries by lamplight, carry the same sleepy cadence. They remind us that human folly is nothing new. Whether in Thebes, Troy, or your local office, the pattern is the same: pride, mistakes, consequences. The house of Atreus, a family that should have stayed. Extinct. So far, we've met gods with poor impulse control, heroes doomed by fate, and royals who managed to ruin dinner parties on a cosmic scale. But now, let's wander slowly into one of the most notoriously cursed bloodlines in Greek storytelling, the House of Atreus. If you ever feel like your own family is dramatic, just remember this dynasty. Compared to them, even the most chaotic holiday gathering looks tame. It all begins with Tantalus, a king of Lydia and one of Zeus's many mortal offspring. Tantalus, in theory, had everything: wealth, power, and the favor of the gods. Naturally, he ruined it. He invited the gods to a banquet, then tried to test their omniscience by serving them a stew made from his own son, Pelops. Yes, he thought it would be funny or enlightening to see if they noticed. They did. The gods were horrified, except for Demeter, who, distracted by grief, absent-mindedly ate part of the shoulder, which must have made for a very awkward silence around the table. The gods restored Pelops to life, replacing the missing shoulder with ivory. Tantalus, meanwhile, was condemned to eternal torment in the underworld. Standing in water he could never drink, beneath fruit he could never reach. That's where we get the word tantalize. Eternal thirst and hunger, brought on by his own spectacular lack of hosting skills. Pelops grew up to become a powerful figure himself, but the family curse was far from over. To marry Hippodamia, he had to win a chariot race against her father, King Oenomaus. The king, understandably protective, challenged every suitor and killed them when they lost. Pelops, however, cheated. He bribed the king's charioteer, Myrtilus, to sabotage the wheels. Pelops won, Oenomaus died, and Pelops killed Myrtilus afterward just to tie up loose ends. Myrtilus cursed him with his dying breath, because, of course, he did. And thus the house of Atreus inherited not just wealth, but a fresh blood curse. From Pelops came two sons, Atreus and Thyestes, brothers, kings, and predictably, rivals. Atreus and Thyestes spent most of their careers in a cycle of betrayal. Thyestes seduced Atreus's wife. Atreus responded by inviting him to a banquet and feeding him his own children, a culinary tradition clearly running in the family. When Thyestes discovered what he'd eaten, he cursed Atreus, because apparently this family couldn't go 2 generations without at least one curse floating around the dining room. Now, Atreus's sons were Agamemnon and Menelaus, names that might sound familiar. Yes, the very kings who led the Greeks in the Trojan War. Agamemnon, as we've seen, sacrificed his daughter Iphigenia to Artemis just to get favorable winds. Menelaus, meanwhile, lost his wife Helen to Paris, setting off 10 years of carnage. Clearly, the family curse was working overtime. When Agamemnon finally returned from Troy, he was murdered by his wife Clytemnestra and her lover Aegisthus, who happened to be Thyestes' son. In other words, one cousin avenging his father by helping his aunt kill his uncle. A tidy little revenge cycle. Naturally, Agamemnon's children then took their turn. Orestes killed his mother to avenge his father. Electra cheered him on. The Furies hounded Orestes for matricide, and so on, until audiences presumably fell asleep out of sheer exhaustion. What makes the House of Atreus so fascinating, at least, in a slow bedtime kind of way, is how repetitive it all becomes. Banquets, betrayals, blood, a new curse with every generation. It's almost comical in its predictability. You can picture the family gathering. Who's hosting dinner this year? Not Atreus. Last time we had children in the stew. Maybe Menelaus? Oh, wait, his wife just launched an international war. It's no wonder Greek playwrights loved them. These stories became tragedies performed in Athens, with audiences nodding along to the familiar beats of betrayal and doom, and maybe, just maybe, feeling a little better about their own families. From here, it's not hard to see the bridge into real European history. The Habsburgs, the Tudors, the Bourbons, they all had their own versions of curses. Inbreeding, betrayals, dynasties collapsing under the weight of their own egos. But before we leave myth entirely, let's drift through one more cursed family. The descendants of Cadmus, founder of Thebes. Cadmus himself was unlucky from the start. sent to find his sister Europa, yes, the same one carried off by Zeus the bull. He never succeeded. Instead, he followed a cow, because of course, to a site where he founded Thebes. There, he killed a dragon sacred to Ares. To make up for this, he had to serve Ares for 8 years. An odd punishment, though possibly less irritating than jury duty. From Cadmus came a line of rulers whose lives unraveled spectacularly. His great-great-grandson was Pentheus, king of Thebes, who banned the worship of Dionysus, which was not wise. The women of Thebes, driven into frenzy, tore Pentheus apart, his own mother among them. Then there was Laius, the king who tried to kill his son Oedipus. We know how that ended. Thebes, in general, was a city cursed to suffer. Every ruler seemed to inherit new disasters, plagues, wars, fratricide. If Athens was the shining city of philosophy, Thebes was the eternal cautionary tale. So as we close this part of our drifting journey, notice how myth bleeds into history. These dynasties of legend, Atreus, Cadmus, feel strangely familiar. Fragile bloodlines, petty rivalries, disasters repeating with clockwork precision. The Greeks may have wrapped their tales in gods and monsters, but the pattern? The pattern is universal. And with that thought, let's float onward, leaving myth gently behind, and begin to drift into the real royal families of Europe next time. Families every bit as cursed, just without the literal minotaur. The House of Atreus, a family that should have stayed. Extinct, so far we've met gods with poor impulse control, heroes doomed by fate, and royals who managed to ruin dinner parties on a cosmic scale. But now, let's wander slowly into one of the most notoriously cursed bloodlines in Greek storytelling, the House of Atreus. If you ever feel like your own family is dramatic, just remember this dynasty. Compared to them, even the most chaotic holiday gathering looks tame. It all begins with Tantalus, a king of Lydia and one of Zeus's many mortal offspring. Tantalus, in theory, had everything: wealth, power, and the favor of the gods. Naturally, he ruined it. He invited the gods to a banquet, then tried to test their omniscience by serving them a stew made from his own son, Pelops. Yes, he thought it would be funny or enlightening to see if they noticed. They did. The gods were horrified, except for Demeter, who, distracted by grief, absent-mindedly ate part of the shoulder, which must have made for a very awkward silence around the table. The gods restored Pelops to life, replacing the missing shoulder with ivory. Tantalus, meanwhile, was condemned to eternal torment in the underworld. Standing in water he could never drink, beneath fruit he could never reach. That's where we get the word tantalize. Eternal thirst and hunger, brought on by his own spectacular lack of hosting skills. Pelops grew up to become a powerful figure himself, but the family curse was far from over. To marry Hippodamia, he had to win a chariot race against her father, King Oenomaus. The king, understandably protective, challenged every suitor and killed them when they lost. Pelops, however, cheated. He bribed the king's charioteer, Myrtilus, to sabotage the wheels. Pelops won, Oenomaus died, and Pelops killed Myrtilus afterward just to tie up loose ends. Myrtilus cursed him with his dying breath, because, of course, he did. And thus the house of Atreus inherited not just wealth, but a fresh blood curse. From Pelops came 2 sons, Atreus and Thyestes, brothers, kings, and predictably, rivals. Atreus and Thyestes spent most of their careers in a cycle of betrayal. Thyestes seduced Atreus's wife. Atreus responded by inviting him to a banquet and feeding him his own children, a culinary tradition clearly running in the family. When Thyestes discovered what he'd eaten, he cursed Atreus, because apparently, this family couldn't go 2 generations without at least one curse floating around the dining room. Now, Atreus's sons were Agamemnon and Menelaus, names that might sound familiar. Yes, the very kings who led the Greeks in the Trojan War. Agamemnon, as we've seen, sacrificed his daughter Iphigenia to Artemis just to get favorable winds. Menelaus, meanwhile, lost his wife Helen to Paris, setting off 10 years of carnage. Clearly, the family curse was working overtime. When Agamemnon finally returned from Troy, he was murdered by his wife Clytemnestra and her lover Aegisthus, who happened to be Thyestes' son. In other words, one cousin avenging his father by helping his aunt kill his uncle. A tidy little revenge cycle. Naturally, Agamemnon's children then took their turn. Orestes killed his mother to avenge his father. Electra cheered him on. The Furies hounded Orestes for matricide, and so on, until audiences presumably fell asleep out of sheer exhaustion. What makes the house of Atreus so fascinating, at least, in a slow bedtime kind of way, is how repetitive it all becomes. Banquets, betrayals, blood, a new curse with every generation. It's almost comical in its predictability. You can picture the family gathering. Who's hosting dinner this year? Not Atreus. Last time we had children in the stew. Maybe Menelaus? Oh wait, his wife just launched an international war. It's no wonder Greek playwrights loved them. These stories became tragedies performed in Athens, with audiences nodding along to the familiar beats of betrayal and doom, and maybe, just maybe, feeling a little better about their own families. From here, it's not hard to see the bridge into real European history. The Habsburgs, the Tudors, the Bourbons, they all had their own versions of curses. Inbreeding, betrayals, dynasties collapsing under the weight of their own egos. But before we leave myth entirely, let's drift through one more cursed family. The descendants of Cadmus, founder of Thebes. Cadmus himself was unlucky from the start. Sent to find his sister Europa, yes, the same one carried off by Zeus the bull, he never succeeded. Instead, he followed a cow, because of course, to a site where he founded Thebes. There, he killed a dragon sacred to Ares. To make up for this, he had to serve Ares for 8 years. An odd punishment, though possibly less irritating than jury duty. From Cadmus came a line of rulers whose lives unraveled spectacularly. His great-great-grandson was Pentheus, king of Thebes, who banned the worship of Dionysus, which was not wise. The women of Thebes, driven into frenzy, tore Pentheus apart, his own mother among them. Then there was Laius, the king who tried to kill his son Oedipus. We know how that ended. Thebes, in general, was a city cursed to suffer. Every ruler seemed to inherit new disasters, plagues, wars, fratricide. If Athens was the shining city of philosophy, Thebes was the eternal cautionary tale. So as we close this part of our drifting journey, notice how myth bleeds into history. These dynasties of legend, Atreus, Cadmus, feel strangely familiar. Fragile bloodlines, petty rivalries, disasters repeating with clockwork precision. The Greeks may have wrapped their tales in gods and monsters, but the pattern? The pattern is universal. And with that thought, let's float onward, leaving myth gently behind, and begin to drift into the real royal families of Europe next time. Families every bit as cursed, just without the literal minotaur. Peculiar kings, petty queens, and routines. Gone wrong so far, we've floated from cursed Greek dynasties into the frailty of the Habsburgs and the overindulgence of Louis XIV. But crowns were not only worn by the inbred or the extravagant. Some rulers, through quirks of personality or sheer stubbornness, left behind reputations less for conquests and more for their peculiar habits. Let's drift slowly through a few. First, let's pause at George III of Britain. You probably know him as the king who lost America, which, to be fair, is not an item any monarch wants on their resume. But George's story is much sadder than the cartoons. For years, he suffered from what was probably a form of porphyria, a genetic disorder. His symptoms included abdominal pain, hallucinations, and bouts of mania where he talked incessantly. Courtiers whispered that he spoke for hours without stopping, sometimes until he foamed at the mouth. One doctor recorded that George once shook hands with a tree, convinced it was the King of Prussia. Yet for all that, he was a man of earnest habits. He rose early, avoided alcohol, and loved farming, so much that people mocked him as Farmer George. In another life, he might have been content pottering in a garden. Instead, he was king, and every lapse of his illness became a political crisis. By the end, his condition worsened into permanent madness. Blind, deaf, and raving, he spent his final decade isolated, while his son ruled as regent. And still, in the public memory, he is both mocked and pitied, a monarch undone less by politics than by the chemistry of his own blood. Now let's drift toward another royal oddity, King Christian VII of Denmark. Christian became king in 1766 at the age of 17, and he was, to put it gently, not well suited to the job. Reports describe him as unstable, plagued by paranoia, and obsessed with self-destructive habits. He enjoyed slapping people in the face, attacking his courtiers, and playing pranks that went well beyond charming. His marriage to Caroline Matilda, sister of George III, was predictably unhappy. She once described him as a boy who will never grow up, which was accurate. Christian spent most of his reign in the grip of mental illness, leaving the real power to his physician, Johann Struensee. Struensee became both doctor and de facto ruler of Denmark. He introduced reforms, abolished torture, and tried to modernize the state. He also, inconveniently, became the Queen's lover. When the scandal broke, Struensee was executed, Caroline was exiled, and Christian was left once again to his instability. The kingdom survived somehow, but Christian's reign is remembered. Less for policy, more for the tragic spectacle of a man wholly unsuited to the crown. Next, let's float gently to Bavaria, where we meet King Ludwig II, the so-called Mad King. Ludwig ascended the throne in 1864 at just 18. He was shy, dreamy, and utterly uninterested in politics. Instead, he devoted himself to art, architecture, and his idol, Richard Wagner. He funded Wagner's operas to excess, nearly bankrupting his kingdom, and spent enormous sums on fantastical castles. The most famous, Neuschwanstein, still stands today, a fairy tale palace perched among the Bavarian Alps. Tourists flocked to it, Disney copied it, and yet at the time it was considered absurd extravagance. Ludwig built it not to host government functions, but as a private retreat from reality. He withdrew further into fantasy as the years passed, wandering the halls of his castles by candlelight, eating at tables set for imaginary guests. His ministers declared him insane and had him deposed. Days later, he was found dead in a lake alongside his psychiatrist. Whether suicide, accident, or something darker, no one can say. And yet, of all the eccentric kings, Ludwig may be the most beloved today. His castles bring in more money to Bavaria than his government ever dreamed of in his lifetime. Madness, perhaps, but profitable madness. Now, if you're still awake, let's gently drift to France once more, but not to Louis XIV. This time, we'll pause at his descendant, Charles VI, nicknamed Charles the Mad. Charles came to the throne in the late 14th century, young, handsome, and promising. But soon his mind unraveled. He suffered psychotic breaks that left him unrecognizable. Once, he attacked his own knights in a sudden frenzy, nearly killing several before being restrained. He also developed unusual delusions. At times, he believed he was made of glass. He refused to let people touch him for fear he would shatter. He reinforced his clothing with iron rods to prevent accidental breakage. Courtiers had to tread carefully, both literally and figuratively. France, meanwhile, drifted toward collapse. Civil war between rival factions broke out, and the English exploited the chaos in the 100 Years' War. While Charles wandered the palace convinced he was transparent, his kingdom fractured around him, And then there's Joanna of Castile. History remembers her cruelly as Juana la Loca, Joan the Mad. She was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, the Catholic monarchs who sent Columbus across the Atlantic. Joanna married Philip the Handsome, a Habsburg prince. Handsome he may have been, but faithful he was not. Joanna adored him to the point of obsession, while he strayed constantly. When Philip died suddenly in 1506, Joanna's grief tipped into legend. She refused to part with his body. She traveled across Spain with his coffin, insisting he be kept close. Chroniclers, ever eager for drama, wrote that she opened the coffin to embrace him, or that she kept other women away from the corpse out of jealousy. Whether true or exaggerated, her behavior cemented her reputation. Her father and later her son confined her for decades in Tordesillas, declaring her mad. Perhaps she was, or perhaps she was simply inconvenient, a woman with a claim to power, sidelined under the cloak of insanity. Notice how familiar these patterns feel. Just like the Greek myths, these rulers were undone not always by armies, but by themselves. Fragile minds, obsessions, eccentricities, magnified by the crown on their heads. They were human beings with human flaws, forced to live inside gilded cages. Some retreated into madness, some into fantasy. Others clung to power until they shattered. And through it all, their subjects whispered stories, the same way the Greeks whispered of Atreus or Oedipus. Stories to explain why their rulers, draped in jewels, so often resembled broken glass. And with that, let's drift onward. Next time, we'll wander through the pettier side of monarchy, the feuds, tantrums, and theatrical displays of ego that, in their own strange way, are even more soothing at bedtime. Pettiness in crowns and velvet by now, we've seen monarchs undone by frailty, madness, and genetic misfortune. But sometimes the real entertainment lies not in tragedy, but in sheer pettiness. Kings and queens with vast armies and sprawling empires reduced to sulking over etiquette or the wrong shade of embroidery. It's a reminder that for all their grandeur, many royals spent their days in a haze of grievances that would make a schoolyard look dignified. Let's start with Queen Victoria. Victoria ruled Britain for more than 60 years, presiding over an empire on which, as they like to say, the sun never set. She was formidable, dignified, and deeply opinionated, which is a polite way of saying she nursed grudges with the endurance of an Olympic athlete. Take her relationship with her daughter-in-law, Alexandra of Denmark. Alexandra was married to Victoria's son, the future Edward VII. She was elegant, popular, and adored by the public. Naturally, Victoria disliked her. Victoria criticized Alexandra's fashion sense, her spending, and most of all her disability. Alexandra walked with a limp after a childhood illness, but rather than show sympathy, Victoria complained that it made public appearances awkward. It didn't help that Alexandra's family in Denmark had long feuded with Germany, while Victoria was firmly pro-German. The tensions simmered for decades. Victoria also detested the Irish. Famously, when visiting Dublin, she refused to use the word Ireland, calling it instead that miserable country. When an Irish servant asked her for a glass of water, she snapped, "What next, champagne?" A monarch, but one who found satisfaction in tiny acts of meanness. Let's drift onward, softly, to Louis XIV of France. Louis XV inherited the throne as a child and grew into a monarch known as Louis the Well-Beloved. Which is ironic because by the end, he was detested. He had mistresses, yes, but in the pettiness of court life, the problem wasn't that he had mistresses, it was which mistresses. His most famous companion was Madame de Pompadour, a bourgeois, woman who rose to astonishing influence. Nobles loathed being eclipsed by someone of such modest birth. Pompadour, however, was clever enough to outmaneuver them all, orchestrating operas, designing palaces, and charming foreign dignitaries. The court seethed. Pamphlets spread mocking her, often with anatomical creativity. Louis, meanwhile, sulked whenever anyone dared criticize her. For years, entire factions of French politics revolved not around policy, but around whether one adored or despised Madame de Pompadour. The irony, of course, is that while Louis clung to his mistresses and their parties, France's finances sank. The well-beloved king spent his reign trading insults and jealousies while quietly setting the stage for the revolution, and then we have the Habsburgs again. Because if ever there was a dynasty addicted to petty drama, it was theirs. Take Maria Theresa, the only female ruler of the Habsburg dominions. She was brilliant, commanding, and mother to 16 children, one of whom would become Marie Antoinette. But she had a habit of writing long, exasperated letters to her children about their behavior. Marie Antoinette, sent to France as a teenager, received constant reprimands from her mother. Her hair was too big, her dresses were too expensive. She was too frivolous at parties, which, to be fair, she was. But the letters dripped with maternal disappointment, which only drove Marie deeper into extravagant habits. The pettiness passed from one generation to the next, like a family heirloom no one wanted, but everyone inherited. Now, let's pause, gently at Peter the Great of Russia. Peter is remembered as a titan, modernizing Russia, dragging it into European fashion, building cities from swamps. But he was also, in daily life, spectacularly petty. He had an obsession with shaving beards. At the time, Russian nobles wore long beards as symbols of tradition. Peter, enamored of Western Europe, despised them. So he imposed a beard tax. Men who wished to keep their beards had to pay a fee and carry a special token proving they'd paid. Without it, officials might shave them on the spot. Peter also delighted in humiliating his nobles with bizarre rituals. He invented the all-drunken synod of fools and jesters, a parody of religious ceremonies in which courtiers were forced to drink themselves into stupors while dressed in ridiculous costumes. Imagine an empire ruled by a man whose idea of reform included compulsory binge drinking. Naturally, many courtiers complied, though one suspects with limited enthusiasm. Let's drift toward Spain again. Philip II, ruler of a global empire in the 16th century, had one of the most micromanaging personalities in royal history. Philip loved paperwork. He would sit in his study for 16 hours a day, reading, annotating, and signing endless documents. Ministers despaired because Philip insisted on handling every matter personally, from wars to petitions about local taxes. This obsession with control became absurd. One Spanish town requested permission to hold a festival. The petition languished on Philip's desk for 2 years. By the time he approved it, the festival had long since passed. But Philip was satisfied. He had, in his mind, upheld the dignity of monarchy by inspecting every line. His pettiness extended to his personal life as well. He distrusted anyone who smiled too much, declaring it a sign of dishonesty. He also preferred windows closed, convinced that fresh air spread disease. A ruler of the world, suffocating himself in stale rooms, lost in paperwork. If you're still with me, half dozing by now, let's close Part 7 with a queen famous not for grandeur, but for one of the pettiest rivalries in royal history, Elizabeth. Eye of England Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, ruled with cunning and charisma. But she also had a lifelong feud with her cousin Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary was glamorous, Catholic, and had an undeniable claim to Elizabeth's throne. Elizabeth resented her, feared her, and could not stop comparing herself to her. She criticized Mary's beauty, her marriages, her missteps. Eventually, she imprisoned her cousin for 19 years, a kind of long, drawn-out sibling spat magnified into state policy. Finally, Elizabeth signed Mary's death warrant. When the executioner botched the job, taking 3 swings to remove Mary's head, her little dog ran out from under her skirts, covered in blood. It was a grisly end to what was, in many ways, the most extended episode of royal pettiness in history. Notice how these stories, like the myths, revolve not around grand battles, but around fragile egos. Monarchs with entire kingdoms at their command, fretting about facial hair, fashion, or who got to be prettier at court. In the end, their pettiness shaped history. Empires rose and fell not just from wars, but from sulks, rivalries, and jealousies. Just as in Greek myth, where a quarrel over a golden apple led to the Trojan War, so too in Europe did vanity and spite ripple into catastrophe. And with that, let's drift onward. In the next part, we'll wander through the stranger habits of monarchs, their food, their sleeping arrangements, and the little routines that made royal life as bizarre as it was gilded. Strange habits in crowns and courts. By now we've drifted through myths, madness, and pettiness. But sometimes the most telling details of royalty lie not in their battles or politics, but in how they spent their mornings, their dinners, and their nights. And as with everything in court life, the stranger, the habit, the more faithfully it was followed. Let's begin, gently, with Louis XIV of France. Louis, the Sun King, reigned for more than 70 years, and in that time developed perhaps the most elaborate daily routine of any monarch. Every morning he awoke in his gilded bedchamber at Versailles, where a crowd of nobles gathered to watch him. Get dressed. The ritual was called the lever, or rising. First came the petit lever, attended by his closest courtiers, where Louis sat up in bed and received his wig, his slippers, and sometimes a brief report about the kingdom. Then came the grand lever, when dozens more nobles were admitted to watch the king be washed, combed, and dressed, layer by layer. Imagine it, a grown man, the most powerful monarch in Europe, turning his daily act of putting on trousers into an audience event. Nobles competed fiercely for the honor of handing him his stockings, or, in a true career highlight, holding his shirt. This wasn't humiliation, it was power. By making his routine a spectacle, Louis forced his court into constant competition for proximity. Naturally, he thrived on it. At night, the process reversed, with the coucher, or going-to-bed ritual. Nobles stood in hushed reverence as Louis undressed. A life lived as theater, from dawn to dusk. If Louis was theatrical, Frederick William I of Prussia was the opposite. Known as the Soldier King, he despised luxury, and yet his habits were no less peculiar. He rose before dawn, often at 4 a.m., and ate the same breakfast every single day: salted herrings, black bread, and beer. He detested formal court banquets, preferring enormous quantities of plain food consumed rapidly. His favorite dish was pickled cabbage, eaten in silence. Despite his austerity, Frederick William had one indulgence: his obsession with very tall soldiers. He created a special regiment known as the Potsdam Giants, composed exclusively of men over 6 feet tall. He scoured Europe for recruits, purchasing tall men from foreign courts or even kidnapping them when necessary. Some soldiers were so tall they had to crouch to fit under palace doors. For Frederick William, this was not just a hobby, it was his pride. He measured his power not in gold or palaces, but in inches of height. Let's drift softly eastward to Catherine the Great of Russia. Catherine is remembered for her intelligence, her reforms, and her expansion of Russia's empire. But her daily routines reveal a curious mixture of discipline and indulgence. She rose early, often before 6, and immediately began reading letters or reports. Catherine prided herself on being an enlightened despot, and her mornings were spent in correspondence with philosophers like Voltaire and Diderot. But she was also vain about her appearance. Every morning she took hours to dress, surrounded by servants who powdered her hair, arranged her gowns, and applied the elaborate cosmetics of the day. Meals at her court were vast affairs, often lasting 3 hours, but Catherine herself ate sparingly. Her favorite drink was hot chocolate, which she consumed daily. Guests, meanwhile, were expected to gorge themselves on endless courses. Catherine also adored pets, especially dogs. She often had several small dogs with her at once, even during state meetings. At night, her beloved spaniels sometimes slept on her bed. For all her grandeur, the ruler of Russia fell asleep each evening with paws nudging the blankets. Now, gently, we drift to Spain again. Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain, was one of the most powerful men of the 16th century. Yet, his daily habits betrayed a man of unusual fragility. Charles suffered from severe gout, the result of his enormous appetite. He devoured rich foods, especially red meats, and washed them down with copious amounts of beer and wine. He once attempted to moderate his diet by cutting out fish. The result was predictably catastrophic. His gout worsened, leaving him often bedridden. Despite this, Charles insisted on formality in his routines. His servants carefully arranged his meals in ceremonial order, even when he was too ill to eat more than a bite. By the end of his life, Charles had retreated to a monastery, where he continued to stage elaborate royal meals, while only nibbling at boiled vegetables. Power reduced to habit, even when appetite had long since vanished. And speaking of eating, let's pause with Henry VIII of England. Henry is remembered for his 6 wives, his break with Rome, and his expanding waistline. His meals were legendary. Breakfast was modest, a few eggs, perhaps ale. But dinner, served around 10 a.m., was staggering. Dozens of courses, from roasted swans to pies filled with spiced game. Dessert often included sugared fruits, jellies, and mountains of marzipan. Henry believed in the restorative power of food, particularly meat. He consumed so much red meat that by his later years he suffered from chronic constipation and ulcers. Doctors prescribed more food naturally. At banquets, Henry would sit at a raised table while musicians played softly in the background. He ate slowly, majestically, while courtiers watched, waiting for leftovers, because in Tudor courts, leftovers were a perk. Once the king had finished, servants and courtiers could scramble for scraps. The more gnawed bones one secured, the higher. One's standing, or at least one's dinner. Let's drift to something quieter, sleep itself. Royal sleeping arrangements could be surprisingly strange. For instance, Louis XV of France believed fresh air was dangerous. He ordered his bed surrounded by curtains, which were tightly closed each night. Inside the cocoon, the air grew stifling, but Louis was convinced this would keep him safe from illness. In England, Elizabeth V famously slept with a dagger at her bedside. She claimed it was for protection, though one suspects it was also a comforting symbol of control. Elizabeth rarely slept well. She suffered from insomnia and sometimes paced her chambers late into the night, muttering about courtiers and conspiracies. Napoleon. Bonaparte, centuries later, preferred short bursts of sleep. He claimed he needed only 4 hours a night, though in truth he often dozed off in carriages, at council meetings, and even during Mass. For all his grand strategies, Napoleon lived in a permanent state of exhaustion, held together by willpower and habit. Finally, let's close Part 8 with a gentler figure. George VI of Britain, father of Queen Elizabeth II. George was a shy, anxious man who never expected to be king. His daily habits were simple. He rose early, walked his dogs, and took cold baths, believing they built character. He disliked public appearances but found solace in routines. He smoked heavily, sometimes 20 cigarettes a day, and stammered when forced to speak. Yet his evenings were almost ordinary. He would gather with his wife and daughters to play board games or listen to the wireless. For all the pomp of monarchy, his daily life was strikingly quiet, almost domestic. A reminder that even kings can cling to little rituals, not for power, but for comfort. So we see kings and queens bound not only by crowns and thrones, but by the odd details of daily life. Meals stretched into theater, dogs curled up in royal beds, soldiers collected for their height, and nobles scrambling for the honor of handing a stocking. Power is vast, but habit is small, and sometimes it's the small habits that linger longest. Let's drift onward. In the next part, we'll explore royal childhoods, the sickly, spoiled, and sad little heirs raised in palaces, destined for crowns they could barely carry. Sickly, spoiled, and sad. Royal childhoods. So far, we've wandered through myths, marriages, and mealtime oddities. Now, let's turn the lamp a little lower and look at something quieter. Royal childhoods. It's tempting to imagine palaces full of happy children running down gilded corridors. In truth, royal heirs often lived lives far more constrained and far stranger than their subjects could ever imagine. They were raised as symbols, not as people, which is perhaps why so many of them grew up odd, fragile, or deeply unhappy. Let's begin gently with Charles II of Spain. Charles was the final Habsburg king of Spain and the product of centuries of dynastic inbreeding. His parents were uncle and niece, which in itself was hardly unusual for the family. Unfortunately, the consequences were clear from the start. Charles was born with severe physical and intellectual disabilities. His jaw jutted so far forward that he struggled to chew or speak. He had trouble walking until he was nearly 8. And when he did, he shuffled unsteadily. His tutors despaired of teaching him even the simplest lessons. And yet, because he was the heir, his court surrounded him with deference. When he fell ill, which was often, priests were called to perform exorcisms, convinced his weakness was caused by witchcraft. Imagine being a frail child, too sick to play, and having strangers chant prayers over your bed in the belief that demons were lodged inside you. Naturally, this did little for Charles's confidence. Still, he survived into adulthood, ruling Spain in name, though in practice his ministers managed affairs. His nickname, whispered behind fans, was El Hechizado, the Bewitched. A child raised to be king, and never quite able to be one. Now let's drift over to France, to Louis XIII. Louis was the son of the Grand Henry IV of France, but his childhood was nothing like grand. After his father's assassination, Louis was crowned at the age of 8. His mother, Marie de Medici, served as regent, and she treated her son less like a monarch in training and more like a rather inconvenient child. Louis was shy, awkward, and chronically ill. His favorite activity as a boy was playing with toy soldiers, which he arranged with painstaking detail. He spoke little, avoided eye contact, and disliked games with other children. When he did become king in name, he was overshadowed first by his mother and later by his minister, Cardinal Richelieu. His childhood gave him little practice at authority. He spent much of his life caught between stronger personalities, never entirely free of the nervous, hesitant boy he had once been. England, of course, had its share of sad heirs, too. Take Edward VI, the boy king who succeeded Henry VIII. Edward became king at 9 years old. 9. At an age when most boys were still learning arithmetic, Edward was sitting on the throne of England, signing royal decrees with a hand that could barely hold a pen. His education had been rigorous. He was fluent in Latin and Greek, well-versed in theology, and carefully indoctrinated with Protestant faith. But he was frail, thin, pale, and sickly. Observers noted that he coughed often and that his color was unhealthful. He adored learning, scribbling notes in the margins of his school books, and he took his kingship seriously, yet his reign lasted only 6 years. Tuberculosis consumed him by age 15. His last recorded words were a whispered prayer, asking God to save his people, a king before puberty, and gone before manhood. Let's drift north to Scotland. Mary, Queen of Scots, had perhaps the strangest of royal childhoods. Mary was crowned queen when she was just 9 months old. At her coronation, she had to be carried into the abbey, a baby in swaddling clothes, while nobles chanted oaths of loyalty to someone who had not yet spoken her first word. Her childhood was spent in political maneuvering. At 5, she was sent to France to be raised in the royal court, intended to marry the French Dauphin. In France, she thrived for a time, educated in music, languages, and courtly manners. She grew tall and graceful, beloved by courtiers. But underneath, her childhood was never her own. Every toy, every lesson, every dress was chosen not for her pleasure, but for diplomacy. A living bargaining chip, she embodied alliances between nations. By the time she was a teenager, she was already queen of one country and queen consort of another. Mary's later life would be full of turmoil, marriages, plots, imprisonment, and execution. But the roots of it all lay in that strange childhood, where infancy and sovereignty blurred into one. Back to Spain for a moment, to Don Carlos, son of Philip II. Don Carlos is often remembered as unstable, cruel, and paranoid, and much of that can be traced to his childhood. Like Charles II, he was born of Habsburg inbreeding, and his health was fragile from the start. As a child, Carlos was prone to violent mood swings. He delighted in harming animals and once tried to burn servants alive. He was also physically weak, with a deformed spine and uneven legs. Despite these obvious difficulties, his tutors pushed him through a harsh education, berating him when he fell behind. By adolescence, Carlos was unbalanced, mistrusted by everyone around him. He demanded command of armies, but collapsed when faced with actual responsibility. His father, Philip II, eventually had him confined in a palace prison, where Carlos wasted away and died before 30. A childhood of expectation, warped into a lifetime of fear and failure. Royal childhoods weren't always sad in the tragic sense. Sometimes they were just absurd. Consider Louis XV of France. When he was born, no one expected him to become king. He was a distant relative, far down the line of succession. But one by one, every closer heir died. Smallpox, measles, accidents. By the time Louis was 5, he was the last boy standing. His childhood suddenly shifted. From a relatively carefree life, he was placed under constant surveillance. Guards shadowed him, servants hovered, and tutors filled his days with lessons. His food was tested for poison, and he was never allowed to be alone. As a result, Louis grew up anxious and withdrawn, suspicious of those around him. He was clever but timid. Even as king, he preferred hunting or quiet amusements to court life. His childhood, stolen by accident of survival, left him ill-prepared for the crown he eventually wore. And finally, let's drift softly to Russia again. Ivan the Foss, better known as Ivan the Terrible, Ivan's childhood was less gilded, more brutal. His father died when he was 3, his mother when he was 8. As a boy, Ivan was left in the Kremlin surrounded by power-hungry boyars who neglected and often abused him. He wore ragged clothes, went hungry, and lived in fear of being poisoned. Sometimes nobles beat him for sport. Other times, they ignored him entirely, leaving him to wander the palace alone. It's perhaps no surprise that young Ivan developed a cruel streak. He took pleasure in throwing animals from towers or tormenting servants. By the time he reached his teens, he had already grown suspicious, calculating, and angry. That neglected, abused child became the man history remembers as Ivan the Terrible. His terror was born in childhood shadows. So many heirs, raised not to play but to rule, crowned in cradles, taught languages before laughter, fed on duty rather than affection, and though some grew into competent monarchs, many remained forever, shaped by those early years. Timid, fragile, suspicious, or cruel. A reminder, perhaps, that palaces are not always softer places to grow up. Let's drift onward. In the next part, we'll explore royal deaths and funerals, because if royal childhoods were strange, their endings were often stranger still. Royal deaths and funerals. We've wandered through myths, dynasties, marriages, meals, and the fragile years of royal childhood. It feels fitting now to drift toward the end, the last act of royal lives. Deaths that were rarely graceful, and funerals that were often far stranger than dignified. Let's begin softly with Charles II of Spain. Yes, the same bewitched king we met as a child. Charles spent his life ill and anxious, and his death was much the same. By his late 20s, he was nearly blind, plagued with epileptic fits, and barely able to walk. His physicians tried everything from bleeding him to making him drink potions of ground-up human skulls. Naturally, none of this helped. When Charles finally died at 38, the Spanish court carried out an autopsy. They reported that his body did not contain a single drop of blood, that his heart was the size of a peppercorn, and that his intestines were rotted. His head, they claimed, was full of water. In other words, everything that could be wrong was. His funeral was magnificent, of course. Candles, masses, mourning clothes. But behind the solemnity, many simply sighed with relief. The Habsburg line in Spain had ended. Centuries of inbreeding had produced their final heir. Now let's drift to France, and Louis XIV, the so-called Sun King. Louis lived long enough, 72 years on the throne, to become less of a man and more of a fixture, like the furniture of Versailles. By the end, he was old, toothless, and suffering from gangrene in his leg. Doctors debated amputating, but decided it would kill him outright. So instead, they applied ointments and prayers, and waited. The Sun King spent his final days unable to rise from bed, swathed in perfumes to mask the smell of rotting flesh. When he died, the entire court wept loudly, though one imagines some were crying from sheer habit. His funeral was immense. But here's the irony. While the official mourning was grand, the people of Paris quietly celebrated. They were exhausted by his endless wars and taxes. Some even danced in the streets when the sun finally set. England offers us Henry VIII, the great, larger-than-life king. Or, more accurately by the end, larger than anything. By his last years, Henry was obese, covered in ulcers, and carried to and from his throne in a padded chair. His leg wounds oozed constantly, and his temper was, as always, volcanic. When he died in 1547, his courtiers tried to keep it quiet, but nature betrayed them. The king's body, left too long in its coffin, began to swell and burst. One chronicler noted grimly that his corpse leaked out onto the floor. A pack of dogs wandered in and, in the most undignified end imaginable, lapped at the remains. Not quite the stately death one expects of a Tudor monarch. His funeral procession, though grand, carried a secret stench. Behind the velvet and the banners, the court carried a rotting symbol of their troubled dynasty. Let's move north to Russia again, to Peter the Great. Peter was a towering figure, both literally, over 6 feet tall and in reputation. He modernized Russia with a heavy hand, building cities, forcing nobles to shave their beards, and occasionally executing those who disagreed with him. But his death was less impressive. After years of overwork, alcohol, and illness, Peter developed a severe bladder infection. Surgeons attempted to operate without anesthesia, and he endured terrible pain. His last recorded words were interrupted. He tried to dictate, "Leave all to," but could not finish. A man who had reshaped an empire, undone by something as small as infection. His funeral, however, was theatrical. His embalmed body was displayed for weeks, dressed in armor, sitting on a throne, as though he might rise at any moment to continue ruling. Visitors filed past, uneasy in the presence of a monarch who seemed almost unwilling to leave. Back to the French kings for a moment. Louis the XIV had perhaps one of the more ironic deaths. He was enormously fat, rarely left his rooms, and lived off sweets and pastries. By the end, he was so swollen with gout that he could no longer wear shoes, only soft slippers. His courtiers described him as resembling a bloated balloon. When he died, his body was so large it barely fit into the coffin prepared for him. Servants had to press the lid down and fasten it quickly before it burst open. A king who had once dreamed of grandeur, finally reduced to a struggle with carpentry. Of course, sometimes royal deaths were bizarrely casual. Take James the Far of England. James was not the most robust of men, but his final illness was worsened by the doctors who treated him. One applied a poultice of pigeons to his feet, because why not, apparently. Another recommended boiled herbs wrapped around his stomach. James grew weaker, and when he finally passed, rumors spread that he had been poisoned. In truth, it was probably just the medical treatments that killed him faster. His funeral was magnificent, but few mourned deeply. Even at his death, courtiers whispered jokes about his awkward manners and endless lectures. Then there was Queen Victoria, who lived long enough to see herself become more of a national grandmother than a queen. Her final years were spent in mourning, wrapped in black after the death of Prince Albert. By the time she died in 1901, she was half blind, almost deaf, and weary. She left behind precise instructions for her funeral. She did not want black. She wanted white, and she wanted sentimental tokens in her coffin. Albert's dressing gown, locks of her children's hair, and even a plaster cast of his hand. So there she lay, a small woman in a white dress, surrounded by keepsakes. The most powerful woman in the world, remembered in the quiet, private things of a marriage. Finally, perhaps the strangest funeral of all, Alexander III of Russia. Alexander was a giant of a man, broad-shouldered and immensely strong. His death, however, came from something as small as kidney disease. When his coffin was prepared, the undertakers realized a problem. It was too small. The coffin had been built to the standard royal size, but Alexander simply didn't fit. Servants tried to press him in, but his shoulders and head would not bend. Eventually, they had to tilt him at an angle and force the lid shut. At his funeral procession, many noted that the coffin looked oddly misshapen. The mighty Tsar stuffed into his final box like luggage. And so, kings and queens, emperors and Tsars, giants in life, fragile in death. Their funerals were filled with incense, choirs, and banners, but beneath it all lay the same simple truth. They were human. Their bodies failed. Their deaths were rarely noble. Perhaps that's a strangely comforting thought as we settle into sleep. Even the greatest rulers, with crowns and armies, ended in ways often awkward, sometimes humiliating, occasionally absurd. A reminder that history, for all its grandeur, is just people. Living, stumbling, and eventually fading, just like the rest of us. So, as the candles gutter out and the halls fall silent, let's rest here. The royals have had their last bow, and we, at least, can drift into sleep without an audience of courtiers watching our every breath. Good night.